Hey there, everyone. My name's Sarah. I'm from yoganight.com, and I'm here to do a webinar today about how you can make yoga as accessible for everybody that you have in your class. It's focused on teaching, but if we've got anybody here who's a student and wants me to focus to pull out anything particular, then feel free to find me questions at any point. In fact, if anybody has any questions, just throw them in and I'll... 4 years ago now. I've lost track slightly. It was in 2013. It was kind of by accident. I had set myself a challenge for the year of trying something new every week. And one week I just happened to pick yoga. I'd been in a really dark period in my life. I'd put on an awful lot of weight. I got really quite big, extremely unfit. And I wanted to try something physical again, but something that didn't feel scary. And yoga kind of felt like it might give me that. I was really lucky. My first couple of classes, I managed to find a studio that was very, very beginner focused. And that really helped me to kind of throw myself into it, get the basics, and just to kind of give things a try, because everybody else was very much just trying and investigating at the same time. I didn't feel like I was out of place. When I had to move to a different, bigger studio, I started to find things a lot different. Being quite big, it can be really difficult to pull off some yoga poses, particularly if you're doing a really intense practice. And I found that I had to be both quite stubborn and really patient with myself and take extra time to learn how to make the yoga I was doing work for me. I was really, really lucky to be able to attend a workshop that was very much focused around anatomy and how different people's bodies move in different ways, regardless of what shape or size they might be. Some of it's related to the skeleton, some of it's just related to the way your muscles are set up. And that really helped me to start understanding how yoga has to be applied differently for absolutely everybody. And if it wasn't for that single workshop, quite honestly, I don't think I'd be doing yoga now. After several years, I started to actually realize that I was adjusting myself and applying variations to poses that some of my teachers were quite surprised by. In fact, I remember the day I decided that it was all right to go and become a teacher was when one of the teachers of my class actually pointed me out as an example of how to adjust something that he hadn't realized you could adjust. I was like, oh, maybe I can actually do this. And after that, I, about 18 months ago now, went and did my initial teacher training with Happy Jack Yoga in Finland, which was incredible. And I'd recommend that to anybody who's thinking about it. And I'm working my way through the 300 hours training with Happy Jack at the moment. I've been to Bali and Mexico is part of that, and I'm off to Finland next month. So been really looking forward to getting a chance to share with you guys some of what I really like to share with my students, which is how to make sure that the yoga works for them. So first thing I'll talk about is why it's important for yoga to be really accessible to everybody. And that is quite simply that we have a habit when we first start teaching of putting our expectations onto our students to some extent, and we forget that not everybody is able to move in the same way we can or really connect with the things that we're doing in the same way that we are. And some people who might come into your class may be absolutely terrified. And the more accessibly you can teach that class, the more you can bring those people in and help them to start to grow and really connect with their practice. Now, if you want to teach an accessible class, you really have to make the decision, am I going to teach a class which is accessible for absolutely everybody? Or am I going to teach a class which is a bit more advanced. You genuinely cannot make something fit absolutely everybody in the room all the time. Most of that comes down to the language you'll use, which I'll touch on at the end, but it's just to make everybody feel comfortable. You may have to consciously make that decision, which is absolutely fine. If you want to teach an advanced class, go for it. But if you want to teach something that's accessible to beginners, maybe those of us who are a bit bigger bodied, you might need to strip back down and really focus on them. And then the more advanced people will adjust around that. Now, the way I've decided to break it down today is by looking at the 4 areas of the body that are particularly problematic for people who are bigger or curvier yogis, depending on how you want to think about it. I'm thinking guys as well as girls here. Admittedly, some of the bits of the body are specific to girls, but that's not to say that the similar things don't apply. So, first that we're going to talk about is boobs. They get in the way. There are some poses which I will actively not practice, particularly shoulder stand, because frankly, I feel like my breasts are going to suffocate me. And I'm not alone in this. When I've done some really good workshops with a lot of other plus size yogis, we all have exactly the same problem. Now, there are 4 different options of dealing with that. One is basically just get on with it, do the pose anyway. Another is actively decide not to do the pose. That's always an option. But I always challenge people to try something once, maybe twice. And if they still really don't like it, it's absolutely fine to then cut that from your repertoire. The other 2 options are, one is get a really, really good sports bra. Slight problem with this is sports bras are not designed to hold your breasts down when you're upside down, unfortunately, but it does work for some people. That's the option I tend to go with most of the time. I've always done when I was at university, I used to do a lot of judo, so I'm used to doing quite intense sports and I feel more comfortable in a really solid sports bra, so that's fine. The other option is actually to get your student to get a strap and fasten the strap around the top of the chest above the breast, and that will act as essentially an upside down sports bra, which should help stop them suffocating. And the 2 poses where that's really the most useful is, one, as I said, shoulder stand, and the other is actually child's pose. Child's pose is a funny pose because for those of us who are bigger bodied, it's actually an incredibly uncomfortable pose until you start to relax into it. And I'll touch again a bit on it later, but it's one of those poses, and this is where I mentioned that we tend to put our expectations onto others. There are a lot of poses that are considered in yoga to be the easier, more relaxed poses, and those are often the hardest for people who are in a curvier body. So, next part of the body that gets in the way that I was going to touch on is the bum. Now, the single biggest pose where, for me, this is a problem is actually in Shavasana. And obviously another pose, that's most people's favorite part of their practice. You get to chill, you get to relax at the end. But the problem is, for anybody who's got a curvier body and a bum that might stick out, if you put your legs down flat on the ground, you create a curve in the spine so that you put pressure on the lumbar spine and lower back. And that's incredibly uncomfortable position to stay in for 5 minutes or longer. Now, there's a really easy way to deal with that, and that is to bend to the student's knees so that their feet are on the ground. And this is what I tend to do when I'm practicing if I don't have any props. If you've got props and you have a couple of options there, one is you can place a bolster under your student's knees, and that will relieve the pressure on the lower back and really help them relax into the pose. The second, which I tend to use if I don't have something as big and solid as a bolster there, is actually to take a couple of blocks and put them underneath the back of the thighs. It takes a little bit of experimenting to find a point that's comfortable, but it will hold things up enough to allow that lower back to lower down to the mat and really, really help it's just something that you've got to allow your students to experiment with. And particularly with that one, when you're first taking people into Shavasana, and I am always very careful to judge the room. If I've got quite a few new people, then I will always give the options about how to adjust Shavasana. If I don't, I like to give people the space to relax and get into it on their own. But that's where I tend to like at the beginning of class to actually ask people if they've done yoga before and see how many new people I've got in the room, so I can work out just how many of those cues that I need to give. And that's become a really, really powerful tool for me. So other parts of the body that get in the way. Thighs are the next one that I'll talk about. Now, thighs actually get in the way a lot more than I ever thought. It's something I've quite recently come to realize. When I'm at my biggest, there's some poses that I find a lot more difficult for no other reason that there's a lot of flesh in the way. You get it stuck essentially in soft tissue compression because there is a lot of me there. And those are dancer's pose particularly, and bow pose as well, because I just can't compress the thigh enough to get my lower leg as high as I want to. And I get frustrated about that, but that's absolutely fine. I will use things like a strap to get up into dancers, or I'll just continue to do locust if I'm practicing and doing bow. The other pose, and again, this is one of those poses that most people won't stop and think about, that some people can find really hard, is standard mountain pose. If you bring your feet together, a lot of people who are bigger will actively have to work really hard to compress their inner thighs together. Again, there's just a lot of flesh there. And that can really, really throw off their balance when they're just standing up straight. So easy way to adjust for that particular one is I always tell my students to keep a slight distance between their feet when I'm teaching that pose. I know there are some styles of yoga out there where you're supposed to keep your feet together for whatever reason, but this is where I say you've got to decide how you want to teach. You can either teach the minutiae that are compatible with the lineage that you're familiar with, or you can take those steps to make sure that people can follow it. That's entirely up to you. Now, the final part of the body that I wanted to touch on is the belly, the tummy. And this is the single biggest part of the body where I think it causes problems for particularly curvy yogis a lot. It gets in the way of so many poses, and there are so many poses where I have thought I must just be inflexible, but over time, as I've started to learn just how much it does get in the way from doing some training with other teachers, then I've started to realize that actually if I just adjust the way that I do that pose, then I can get deeper. Most recently, I've been playing with doing a standing split, and I was finding I couldn't get my leg up behind me to get more than about 90 degrees off the floor. But actually, if I adjust myself slightly, pull my tummy over to one side, then I can get much further down because I suddenly clear that space. And there are so many poses that this can be problematic with. One is your simple forward fold. A lot of people will get stuck not very far down just because their tummy is in the way of the top of the legs. They've hit soft tissue compression and they're not going anywhere. So I will always step my feet slightly wider apart. It's a similar, this thinking is essentially the same for if you had somebody who was pregnant. You have something in the way and you have to move the legs further apart to create space for the belly to go into, which is absolutely fine. The other pose that I find I have to adjust quite a lot to get my belly out of the way is single leg forward fold. Now, there are two ways to adjust that. One is some people will actually have to touch their tummy and pull it out to one side. And it can be quite interesting learning to cue that and becoming confident, both as a teacher and with your students, to actually get them comfortable touching and adjusting their own body. I've found it's a huge thing. As soon as I was able to actually be able to show and demonstrate that you might be able to pull a little bit of excess skin or something out of the way when you were trying to get into a pose, it really opened up my body confidence and my confidence in yoga, which brought my students with me. So really suggest that's something to watch with your students and maybe have a play around with. It's with half the point of yoga is connecting with our bodies, and yet a lot of us are terrified to touch it. The other trick for single leg forward fold is a very simple cue, which you get a lot of bigger people will end up in slightly weird angles as they're trying to lean forward. If you tell them to point their belly button towards their big toe when they're leaning forward into that pose, they will sort their alignment out themselves. For some reason, that just helps to completely reset that whole pose. So I've picked out a couple of different poses there. If there's any particular ones anybody wants to ask about, then do just ping me a message and ask. But from there, I was going to touch on language and how the language that you use in your class can make a huge, huge difference. I'll go through a couple of really useful cues that you could have a play with as well, but we'll see where we get to. The first thing I would say, if you're working to teach a really accessible class, is to make it all right to do any variation. Now, what I mean by that is the student has got to feel confident that they're doing it properly, even if they're doing what in their head might be the easier way out, the way that I'm not doing it properly. So I will actually, as the teacher, usually use a strap or a block and demonstrate with that adjustment for them. So that if the teacher's doing it, that suddenly makes it more acceptable for them to be doing it. You'll find a lot of people, particularly if their body confidence is very low, are so terrified of whether they're doing something right and whether they're capable of doing it, that they will push even harder than somebody who doesn't have those same confidence problems and could end up hurting themselves. So I just like to make the adjustments absolutely valid so they can play with it themselves. And you'll have noticed I said adjustment and variation there. I didn't say modification. Now, that's intentional. The other really key thing, if you're teaching a truly accessible class, is to not create any kind of hierarchy to the way that you do a pose. Don't talk about how something is the more advanced version, or the other phrase that you've got to be careful of is some people will describe the most advanced version of a pose as the fullest expression of a pose. That phrase in itself isn't a bad phrase. In fact, I've heard Jack regularly will say that into your fullest expression of the pose, and that's different. That's saying find the way for you to do it. But just be very careful with your language that you're not suggesting that one way is right, one way is wrong, and give people the space. The other word that I would always avoid if you're trying to keep a class as accessible as possible is the word just. If you say to somebody, oh, we're just going to touch the floor, oh, we're just going to do this, it might not be something that's easy for them. And we aren't in their bodies. We don't know whether it's going to be easy for them or not. And all of us can get caught out with this. I actually realized at a workshop I was at recently that somebody at the back of the class asked the instructor, like, but what if you can't stand on one leg? And I'd always thought I was very open to what might be easy or not easy to other people, but I've always been really strong in my balancing poses. And it didn't occur to me that somebody might not be able to stand on one leg. So it just avoids us making those assumptions, and it stops us from ever describing something in such a way that our students think it should be easy and, oh, but they're saying it's easy. Why am I not finding it easy? And it's just, everything is just, you see, I just said just there, but yeah, let's not do that. The idea is to make them feel as comfortable as possible. The other thing that I'd say be very careful of, and this is not to do with different sizes of yogi, it's be careful around gender-based cueing when you're giving people directions. One example I often catch myself out with is if I'm doing supported fish, I'll tell people to put the block underneath where their bra strap is, which is fine if you've got all women in the room, but you have to be mindful as to whether that's the case, and actually might they need some different direction as to where they're going to need to put it. So just be mindful of who's in the room in relation to that. And yeah. Now, the poses that I really wanted to just reiterate that some people find a lot harder than you'd think, and ways to maybe deal with that when you are teaching a class where, and I've mentioned them before, one is Shavasana, two is Child's Pose, and the other one is Mountain Pose. And they're three probably most basic poses. And yet people in a plus size body can actually find them really, really difficult. In Child's Pose, as well as having the problems with the chest, which you can sometimes find people feel like they're suffocating themselves, the problem that I mentioned before around the thighs not giving people space can also mean they can't push backwards all the way down and get the full stretch out of the pose. And it just stops it being terribly comfortable. Now, you do have the option of maybe going around and helping people and maybe helping them get a bit deeper into the pose. But if you've got somebody who's brand new to yoga, maybe think twice before necessarily coming straight over and helping them a bit further down into that pose specifically. It's the one that we all come to rest, and we tend to make that very clear in our teaching. And if you've got somebody who might be mentally struggling a little bit with the fact that, oh, this is much harder than I thought, why can't I even do this one? And you help adjust them, in their head, that could signal that to them that you think they're doing it wrong, which you may not be your intention whatsoever, but those are the alarm bells that are likely to go off for that kind of person. And at the same time, I mean, I quite like it when somebody comes and helps adjust me a bit deeper into Child's Pose because I can feel the stretch a little bit more, but it doesn't really do anything in the grand scheme of things. So it's not actually going to help much because we're stuck in soft tissue compression. It's just not going to make a huge amount of difference for us. So just something to bear in mind and be careful of in that pose. The other, as I said before, is Shavasana. And I think, as I mentioned before, it can be really key with slightly bigger bodied students or people who've never practiced before to take that little bit more time to set it up. It seems like something you just lie back on the floor and you just chill. But if that's not going to be comfortable for somebody, or you've got somebody who's in this space of, oh, am I doing it right? Am I doing it right? Am I doing it right? Then even just whether you're just meant to be lying on the floor can be quite terrifying. Am I meant to be doing something? Are my hands the right way up? So just taking that time to break it down and explain how they could use some of the props that I mentioned before can really help them actually step into that relaxed state. So that's another really, really key pose. And the third pose that I mentioned, and that was Mountain Pose. Now, what I do at the beginning of not every one of my classes, because if I have one where I know everybody in the room, they've been a few times, I'll probably skip this step. But otherwise, I always run through the alignment people need and what it feels like in different parts of their body. And I always focus on how it should feel, not necessarily how it should look. So particularly in teaching people how to engage the core and where to stand their feet, and it's explaining to them how they should feel connected, balanced, and just get them into that solid, comfortable position that's right for them. And if you can get them standing upright and standing right, and then you're able to explain that feeling is what you're trying to get throughout the other poses, then you've really given them some tools to play with before you get started. Now, the other thing that I really, really think is key, and I've just mentioned it, is whenever you're going through a pose with people, it's important to describe what feeling they're looking for. But linked to what I was talking about with language, you don't want to make it sound like you have to feel a pose in a certain place. Instead of saying something like, you will feel it in your calf or you will feel it in your hamstring, it's worth taking those few extra seconds to explain that some people might feel it in the calf, some might feel it in the hamstring. It depends how tight your legs are. And it will help you to develop that knowledge of what muscles might be slightly different for different people. But it also allows people to know that their experience is absolutely fine, whatever it is. It's not going to be the same as the person next to them. And helping to teach somebody that is really the single biggest thing about making yoga accessible. That was the single penny drop for me that kept me going on a yoga journey. It wasn't that I learned to do shiny, big poses quickly. It wasn't necessarily that I was defying expectations. It was that I learned that what my experience was absolutely perfect. Didn't matter what the person's next to me was. And that's fundamentally the single thing that you're trying to create in the room for people when you're trying to make a class accessible. Now, the only other things that I had to share were just a couple of sneaky cues, which sometimes it's hard to explain why they're easier for people, but just genuinely make their practice a lot more accessible. Now, the first is when you're taking people through a vinyasa flow and you've come back to down dog, normally you would cue people to step or jump to the front of the mat, which is absolutely fine. If you switch that to say, bring your feet towards your hands and your hands towards your feet, and let people work out how to get their hands and their feet back to the same place, you suddenly open that cue up. You don't have to worry about the fact that your belly is in the way if you're stepping forward from downward facing dog, which is another place where the belly is a problem. You don't have to worry about whether you want to try and hop and move a huge amount of weight to the front of the mat. You let people figure that out for themselves. And you will actually find with a lot of bigger yogis, it's actually more comfortable for them to walk the hands back, because that way don't have the belly in the way, and it just allows them to find that point. And you will have to make a slight adjustment when they're back on their feet and maybe step them back to the front of the mat before you start your next sun salutation. But that is a tiny adjustment to make compared to how accessible that makes the move feel for people. Now, the other single cue, and again, this is around the vinyasa flow and the sun salutation, but in this case, sun salutation B. And that's when you are cueing from down dog to either your left or right leg forward to between your hands. Now, the way that I would adjust this cue is you are fundamentally changing it, so it's not quite as clear cut as the previous one. But you have, again, this problem where the tummy is in the way, and it's going to make it really difficult for people to make that step straight down the middle to between the hands. If instead you get them to move the leg either around the outside, there's two ways of doing this. One is literally to get them to do it in a roundabout movement, which will skip out that connection with the belly. The other, and this is the one I will usually cue with a group of beginners, is to drop the opposite knee to the ground and use that knee so that then you can lift that leg up and around and bring it to the front. And I also don't get them to worry about whether it is necessarily between the hands, because that might just be that little bit too much if you've got that soft tissue compression. So let people work that out themselves. And those, particularly for those of us who teach a vinyasa style, like I know we do with the Happy Jack Yoga, are two really, really key cues for any of your classes that you really want to make accessible. Now, I've gone through it pretty high speed, and we've got to about 30 minutes, which is what I was aiming for. Does anybody have any questions that you would like me to cover? If you do, you can just ping me a note on the side. And so I'll give you a moment. Okay, it looks like I've explained myself clearly, so that's all good. Now, if anybody wants to find out any more about how you can teach yoga to people slightly more accessibly, or just generally want to ask me any questions, you can find me at yogaknight.com. My blog on there covers some of the things around how yoga felt to me when I first came into it, how I've used it to grow, and how it's helped me with things like body confidence. So feel free to have a look on there. You might find something that might be really, really useful to take into your classes with you. And if you have any questions, just feel free to message me through the website. And I hope that this webinar has been really useful for you. Thanks so much. Bye.